Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: Stella, Kalaniko, Pamela, and Jeffrey. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes, full books, and fictional readings found nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, let's relax with a listener request about the history of music. We're reading The Evolution of Modern Orchestration by Louis Adolphe Kern, Ph.D., first published in 1908 by the Macmillan Company, New York. Let's begin. Preface. It is not the purpose of this work to write a treatise on instrumentation or to prepare a pedagogical analysis of orchestration only, but rather to trace the evolution of the orchestra and of orchestration in connection with the history of music proper. Special emphasis will be laid upon what may be termed the impelling forces to which the development of orchestration is due. This necessitates a considerable repetition of familiar facts that do not lend themselves to further original treatment. The restatement of such facts, however, would seem to form an indispensable background for the main theme, which is thereby exposed with all its attending phases of logical evolution. In addition to extended studies of orchestral scores themselves, the standard works of Berlioz, Gavert, Riemann, Parry, and others have, as a matter of course, been referred to. The subject under discussion has already been admirably handled by Lavoie in his voluminous work entitled Histoire de l'instrumentation, but it was unquestionably done through French glasses, and the scores of not one German romanticist are submitted to careful analysis beyond those of Weber and Wagner. Parsifal had not been produced at the time when Lavoie's book went to press, nor had such representative composers as Brahms, Saint-Saëns, Tchaikovsky, Dvorak then won their full meed of recognition. It is obvious, therefore, that the orchestration, especially of the 19th century, offers a fertile field for further profitable research. Again, the present writer is not aware of the existence of any comprehensive work in the English language upon the history of the orchestra and of orchestration. Throughout these pages, the achievements of the more prominent composers are set forth in such manner as to indicate not only the distinctive features of their orchestration, but of their general creative ability as well. In each case, the general style of composition and its significance as a contribution to musical literature are first enlarged upon. This is followed by an examination of the differentiated treatment of the strings, the wood, the brass, presented in logical sequence. A final analysis is then made of the individual method of orchestration as a whole, together with its relative value in the evolution of orchestration. In the appendix to this book will be found a few musical illustrations selected from representative orchestral scores. Louis Adolph Kern, Cambridge, Massachusetts, USA, April 30th, 1905. Introductory Note. It was inevitable that in an age marked like the present by specialization in all the arts and in all branches of learning as well, the need would one day be felt of a history of orchestration. In attempting to supply it with this book, Dr. Kern has filled a want in English musical literature. Of treatises devoted to the art of writing for the orchestra, there is no lack. Berlioz, the greatest master of the art before Wagner, wrote such a treatise, which, while it was still looked upon as in many respects a model, was revised and brought down to date by Richard Strauss. But invaluable as this treatise is, and as are the more voluminous treatises of the Belgian Crwth, the German Hofmann, and the Englishman Prout, they are after all study books for the creative musician, and only by laborious comparison of their illustrative examples, or the scores of composers, can the historical inquirer learn aught of the evolution of the art to which they are devoted. Even then his view is restricted practically to the music composed since the closing decades of the 18th century. The explanation of this fact is that while the art of music is always spoken of as young in the handbooks, that of orchestration is much younger. The student of orchestration, say the teachers, can derive little benefit from a study of scores older than those of Haydn and Mozart, because some of the instruments of their predecessors are obsolete, and so is their manner of writing for the instruments still in use. This, however, brings small comfort to the historical investigator, who is quite as desirous to know what the orchestra was like prior to Haydn and Mozart and the Mannheim symphonists, as he is to learn the steps by which it reached its present marvelous efficiency. It is the help which it extends in this direction which makes the Histoire de l'instrumentation of Monsieur Lavoie, to which our author acknowledges indebtedness, valuable. But that work is accessible only to students who have knowledge of the French language. Moreover, there are interesting signs of a return to some of the orchestral instruments which had fallen into disuse when the modern art of orchestration came into existence. It is not only a pious regard and reverence for Bach and Handel, especially the former, which is prompting conductors when performing their works to restore instruments to the orchestra, which were considered hopelessly obsolete only a few decades ago, but also a growing appreciation of the fact that modern substitutes for them have largely failed of their mission. Two facts of large importance confront the careful observer of musical phenomena today. The art of composition has reached that degree of technical perfection, or high virtuosoship, which in the history of all the arts introduces a decay of true creativeness. We have therefore on the one hand excessive admiration for technique per se, and on the other a growing reaction towards old ideals. Of this latter fact, I thought I saw significant evidences in 1900 when, as a member of the international jury at the Paris Exposition, new specimens of a considerable number of archaic musical instruments came into my hands for examination, among them a bass flute for the return of which Mr. Frederick Corder expresses an ardent longing. In his admirable essay on instrumentation in the new edition of Grove's Dictionary of Music and Musicians. Since then, too, we have heard the harpsichord in our concert rooms, seen the oboe d'amore adopted by Richard Strauss, the alto flute by Felix Weingartner, and observed the establishment in America as well as Europe of orchestral and chamber concerts in which music of the 17th and earlier centuries is played upon instruments for which it was written. We shall in all likelihood some day have to extend our treatises on orchestration to include some of the instruments now considered obsolete, and be grateful for all references to them in historical works like the present one. Dr. Kern, the author of this book, is an American composer born in Newark, New Jersey, who has achieved the distinction of having an opera of his writing performed in a European opera house. His Zenobia was brought forward in Bremen on December 1st, 1905. It was the first instance of a performance in Europe of a grand opera composed by a native of the United States. The score of this opera and the subject matter of this book were accepted as a thesis by Harvard University, which conferred the degree of Ph.D. on the author in June 1905. It was the first time that the university bestowed the degree for special work in music. H. E. Krebel, New York, April 1908. The Evolution of Modern Orchestration. Part 1. Preliminaries. Chapter 1. The Cradle of Instrumental Music. An Historical Review. Section 1. Primitive men were no doubt impelled to give utterance to their feelings by a desire for awakening sympathetic response in their fellow beings. Vocal manifestation of feeling developed into incipient melody, hence rudimentary scales. Gestures of dancing suggested rhythm. A fusion of both melody and rhythm led to contrast, and contrast implies symmetry of design. To emphasize rhythm combined with euphony, musical instruments were needed. Relics of certain species of these instruments are analogous to subsequent species of civilized nations. Another source whence music can be traced is in the religious rites of the pagans. Ancient history reveals diversified and widespread musical activity. The oldest representations of musicians are to be found on Egyptian monuments. Through contact with Oriental nations, Egypt possibly founded her system of intellectual music on extraneous principles. On the other hand, she probably influenced the music of the Hebrews, certainly that of the Greeks. Exemplification of Oriental instrumentalists is seen on Assyrian bas-reliefs. One of these, in the possession of the British Museum, represents performers on a drum, a double pipe, a primitive species of the dulcimer, and 7 harps. The preponderance of stringed instruments suggests sensitive appreciation for modulated quality of tone. Constant reference to Hebrew music is, of course, to be found in the scriptures. the classification of singers for temple worship during the reign of Solomon and of David, and the especial importance attached to song with instrumental accompaniment will at once recur to the mind. Greece, during her ascendancy, elevated music to a plane of importance, only secondary to that of her sister art, poetry, whose handmaiden she became. Indeed, though both vocal and purely instrumental music were practiced independently, prominence was bestowed upon the welding together of poetry and music, as embodied in the Athenian tragedies. The Greeks possessed but a theoretical knowledge of harmony. Instrumental accompaniment probably duplicated the vocal melody in unison or octave, and may have added some simple harmonic intervals, such as the fourth or fifth. With the disorganization of Greece, music was transplanted to Rome, and being no longer looked upon as an art, sank into degeneracy. Nevertheless, the fundamental principles governing the science of music as promulgated by the Greek theoreticians were rescued from oblivion by early Roman writers, and these principles, leavened by fragments of melancholy and contemplative strains of Hebraic melody, devolved from the early Christian neophytes, were destined to constitute the rock upon which all subsequent Western ecclesiastical music, even to the present day, has been built. Review thus far tends to show that the objective of prehistoric and anti-Christian musical thought was primarily the emotional expression of human feeling. The growth of musical art was, moreover, amazingly dilatory as compared with that of the other fine arts. Section 2. The next step to record is that of incipient harmonic effects, musical notation, the principles of design. And for centuries the art was now developed exclusively under the beneficent patronage of the Roman Church, persistently along vocal lines, for the church adolescent discountenanced anything suggestive of pagan worship or traceable to depraved Roman orgies. Consequently, instrumental evolution lay quiescent. This was the age of dreary speculation, of highly ingenious and elaborately scientific artifice, yet the results were but puerile, for even such rudiments of modern musical grammar as are readily mastered in our day by a mere child were far beyond the perspective of the early scholastic monks, who arrived at a few tangible results only by the most circuitous methods. Nevertheless, progress, though sluggish, is to be traced in logical sequence. Beginning with the establishment of singing schools by Pope Sylvester and the antiphons and hymns of Ambrosius in the 4th century, it is but necessary to recall the documents of Boetius and of Isidore in the 6th century, the reforms of the Gregories in the 7th and 8th, the Sequentia of Notker in the 9th. More specific were the crude attempts at harmony in the 9th and 10th centuries, as typified by Hucbald's organum, Guido d'Arezzo's notation in the 11th. Finally, the adoption of mensural writing as attributed to Franco de Cologne, 13th, and Johannes de Muris, 14th century. Thus, under the guardianship of the Church, and upon a basis of what has ever been known as the Gregorian chant, a decade of centuries had been consumed in learning to perceive and to apply the fundamentals of melody and of harmony, to discover an adequate interpreter, notation, and an accurate though flexible regulator, rhythm. Section 3. Meanwhile, the folk song, already mentioned in its primogenial character, reasserted itself as the annotator of lyric poetry through the activity of the troubadours from the 11th to the 14th centuries. Of these, the name of Adam de la Hale is of course best known. Just as combined Oriental and Greek traditions form the substructure of the early ecclesiastical modes, so a fusion of the Gregorian chant and the folk song resulted in the establishment of a second, and in this case, more distinctly accretive nucleus. This was of incalculable service, primarily to subsequent secular music as a whole, eventually to instrumentation as a side issue. For the soul of the folk song finds expression in the melodic, and this natural mode of expressing natural emotion, amplified not alone by the peoples of the Romance nations and of the Teutonic races, but also quite especially by such as were of Celtic origin, infused life, color, and variety into the stiff and formal church style then in vogue. Again, la gaie séance required the art of accompaniment. Consequently, this long-neglected acquirement began to awake from its lethargy, so we find the troubadours accompanying their songs with a variety of instruments, such as the crwth, the rebec, the lute, the harp, the viol. The folk song has in the end proved to be the most enduring mode of expressing feeling, representing as it does the natural growth of a nation, influenced by local temperament, climate, history. On every hand, its distinctly indigenous characteristics have stood out in peaceful contrast to the eclectic polyphony of coexisting scientific attempts. And as we know, although the folk song was eclipsed for a time by other forms, it was destined to play an important role, for its loftiest mission was realized not only in connection with the German Singspiel of the 18th century, but also through its application by the great classicists of the same period as contrasting theme for the sonata piece. Section 4. Continuing our chronological review, we trace the propagandism of Italian theoretical principles through France into the Netherlands. Here, during the 15th and early 16th centuries, polyphonic vocal music was reared on the exalted pedestals of noble Gothic architecture. From Dufay, the connecting link between the French and Flemish schools, through Occam, Wasquin de Pré, Villert, to Lasso, the supremacy of musical composition was conceded to the Low Countries, although simultaneous musical activity in Italy was by no means retrogressional. As for the labors of such men as Dunstable in England and Isaac in Germany, the former was not in the direct line either of technical or of aesthetic evolution, whereas the latter was trained in Italy and wrote in the Flemish style. The concentrated results of this era consisted of the consecutive development of the technicalities of counterpoint, growing regard for euphony, and expressive verbal interpretation. Finally, the ascendancy of objective emotionalism. Lasso, embodying in his works the highest ideals of polyphonic writing, transplanted them into Germany. Simultaneously, Palestrina, the greatest purist of Italian vocal writing, was at the zenith of his glory. France had produced Goudamel and Claude Lejeune. The music of England was prominently connected with such names as Murbeck, Tallis, Bird, Morley. The Reformation was exercising a powerful influence upon the art of music in the development of the chorale, and thus in the second half of the 16th century, this wonderful array of coexisting phases of choral art stood prepared for something greater. Pure choral music had been perfected. The era of instrumental music was at hand. For in spite of the rare aesthetic beauty, the intricate yet lucid voice leading, the admirable handling of human voices en masse that signalized the works of Palestrina and Lasso, two essential elements indispensable for further creative expansion, were lacking: rhythm and form. To attain these, new means and methods were necessary. Two possibilities presented themselves: solo singing and instrumental music. Although both of these combined had been subjected to quasi-scientific experiment since time immemorial, the style of writing for them possessed as yet but little individuality. There was indeed much to be done before a permanent basis for modern tonality and modern instrumentation could be secured. The old modal system was still at the root of both sacred and secular music. Harmony was but the adventitious corollary of counterpoint. Only simple diatonic intervals were in use. Incipient harmony could not inspire men to think rhythmically. Pure church music was monotonous and vague. True secular music in erudite form was influenced by the folk song, and showed some progress in rhythmic and simple harmonic effects. These in turn reacted favorably upon the sacred forms. Nevertheless, any attempt at developing motives as the synthetic germs of a composition was not to be thought of until the following century, in connection with instrumental forms. The pith of the conditions prevalent at the close of the era has been happily stated by Parry when he says, "It is though the art was still in too nebulous a state for the essential elements to have crystallized into separate and definite entities." Chapter 2: The Dawn of Independent Instrumentation. Section 1. The awakening interest for instrumental music received its incentive from two distinctive sources: the organ and accompaniment to solo singing. As a natural corollary to centuries of ecclesiastical supremacy in musical composition, the organ had taken first rank among instruments, and was, comparatively speaking, the most advanced, both as to mechanical construction and correlative technique of its performers. Hence the organ was destined to become a spontaneous yet covert connecting link between pure choral and pure instrumental music. The initiative in this progression is due to the direct heirs of the Flemish school, the Venetian organists. Both Andreas Gabrieli, 1510, pupil of Villert, and Marullo, 1533, had begun to add ornamental embellishments to their accompaniments, and although coherence was lacking, the step once taken led to extended experiments. Thus the treatment of further instruments employed in religious worship instinctively received more careful attention. Little by little, composers awoke to the realization that the servile imitation of a cappella polyphonic choral writing hitherto employed, was unsuited to the characteristics of differentiated individual instruments or combinations of instruments. True, the artistic value of these early attempts was but small, and would almost appear as an incompatibility, taking into consideration the fact that their authors were erudite in the subtleties of canonical device. Nevertheless, several tangible results are to be noted. As has been said, instrumental writing acquired a certain amount of individuality. Through search for balance of tone, there was inaugurated a selective process as to the permanent value of each specific genre of an instrument. Instrumental adaptation of choral imitation led to contrast. Expansibility of musical thought was quickened. Thus Flemish influence was kept alive in that the incipient forms of their Venetian disciples, inherited by the subsequent violinist composers, matured into the cyclical sonata. Conspicuous are the organ works of Frescobaldi, 1583 to 1644, the great predecessor of Bach. His labors also directly influenced subsequent clavier music, as developed by Kuhnau in the following century. Credit is due to Giovanni Gabrieli, 1587, for systematic attempts at orchestration and a distinctive style of writing for the violin. This latter, however, had to wait for the development of technique, which, as we shall see, was concurrent with the progress of solo singing. And thus the year 1600, epoch-making in the rehabilitation of the drama, can be likewise referred to as a general starting point for independent instrumentation. Section 2. The second and more powerful incentive that instrumentation received was from monody, in connection with which its function as accompaniment in simplified form was demonstrated. The fons et origo of declamatory recitative are, of course, to be traced to the attempted reforms of the Florentine camerata. Monody was the cradle of opera and oratorio, and became in turn the foster child of her progeny. Now these histrionic roots were diversified and far-reaching. In the first place, during the 2 centuries preceding the era under discussion, the miracle plays and representations of similar purport had had recourse to musical support, though of a nature disjointed and irrelevant. Secondly, the efforts of the troubadours, minstrels, and minnesingers embodied solo singing to instrumental accompaniment and contained elements of the dramatic. Lastly, a newly awakened veneration for everything pertaining to classic Greece revealed the nobility of her drama. This was the causa vera to be espoused, and the evolution of this Renaissance, which reached a climax in 1600, must be traced to the history of the Medici. Toward the close of the 15th century, when 3 generations of that family had brought Florence to the height of her glory, art had received a new impulse under the fostering care of Lorenzo. Moreover, science had acquired the doctrines of the Greek scholars fleeing from Turkish oppression, and the brief interim of asceticism under the sway of the Dominican monk Savonarola was followed by the restoration to power of the Medici. A non-clerical influence in all matters pertaining to art made itself felt, and the founding of the Platonic Academy by Cosimo the Great added fuel to the already existing predilection for the drama as exploited by the ancients. Hence the aim of the amateur poet and composer Bardi and his coterie was to produce a drama which should faithfully conform to the purity and idealism of classic models, and they sought diligently for a clue to original renditions of Attic tragedy, the Dorian choral lyrics, the song lyrics of Anacreon, Sappho, but their conception thereof was based on a fallacy, so that were one to judge the fruits of their labors solely for their intrinsic value, the verdict would be disappointing. On the other hand, the step they took was a gigantic one forward in its revolutionary after results, for the quintessence of recitative and lyrical solo was contained in Galilee's and Caccini's declamatory recitatives, with accompaniment of lute or viol. In Peri's and Caccini's Daphne and Eurydice, the first genuine music dramas in the monodic style, in Cavalieri's allegory or incipient oratorio, L'anima e corpo. All these attempts were infinitely more expressive and effective than the somber selections with which A. Gabrieli and Marullo had been wont to enliven festive secular occasions. Bardi and Corsi, in the face of conservatism and skepticism, had sought to reinstate the principles founded upon the Greek dithyramb. Inspired by the enthusiasm of these two amateurs, the professionals, Peri and Cavalieri, succeeded simultaneously in discovering two rational operatic designs capable of sequent dramatic treatment. Finally, the very nature of the monodic principle was inseparable from instrumental accompaniment, and the primary causes that led to monody, namely expression and dramatic effect, would in themselves insist upon a keener appreciation for instrumental combination as to selection, distribution of parts, dynamics, color scheme. This is borne out to a limited extent in the later works of both Peri and Cavalieri, whose instrumentation, though crude, paved the way for their greater contemporary and eventual successor, Monteverdi. Even though the bulk of the figured bass accompaniment was assigned to the harpsichord, Eurydice called into requisition 1 viol, 3 flutes, and a triplet of instruments of the lute variety. Cavalieri made use of practically the same combination, and even recommended that a violin should duplicate the vocal melody throughout. In contradistinction to these essays at dramatic scoring, should be mentioned the instrumentation of Strigio, 1535, whose intermezzi, or comedies interspersed with music, were written in the madrigal style. Nor should the concertante sacred song of Viadana, 1564, or the instrumental effects of Gibbons, 1583, be overlooked. But Strigio, some 30-odd years before Eurydice was produced, had not only forestalled, but surpassed his immediate successors by the employment of an orchestra, of which more than half were stringed instruments. Again, 7 of these were played with a bow, so that, considering the primitive methods then in use, the constitution of Strigio's orchestra was unique. It consisted of 6 lutes, 7 viols, 2 gravicimbali, 6 flutes, 8 cornetti and tromboni, all of variegated types and sizes. The above enumeration brings to mind the pre-existence of a rather heterogeneous assortment of now partially obsolete instruments with which we are more or less familiar. Therefore, before proceeding from the subject of instrumentation to that of orchestration proper, as inaugurated by Monteverdi, a review of the structural and mechanical evolution of instruments themselves would seem in place. Chapter 3: Evolution of Musical Instruments. The first serious attention bestowed upon the mechanism of instruments and the selection of those whose qualities should justify permanent retention occurred during the 16th century. And as we have seen, the causes that led up to this were extraneous. In glancing over the names and descriptions of the many varieties of instruments already in existence before this development began, the mind becomes easily confused. Many species of stringed instruments, such as lutes, viols, clavichords, harpsichords, not to mention brass instruments, the scalme, cromorns, abounded on every hand. But the deeper the student of instrumental evolution delves into comparative research, the more he finds authorities at variance. However, the lineage of the three great representatives of stringed instruments, as are in use today, instruments played with a bow, the harp, the pianoforte, may fairly be traced simultaneously. Section 1: Prehistoric origin of stringed instruments, in spite of extant relics, is a matter of conjecture. History, on the other hand, suggests various sources in various ages. Of greatest recorded antiquity are the Egyptian lute and harp, which were struck with a plectrum or plucked by the fingers. These migrated through Arabia into Spain, thence to southern Italy, and became diffused over all Europe. The Greek lyra or kithara, having originally but 4 strings, was also played with a plectrum, and became the heirloom of the Romans. But to discover the origin of instruments played with a bow is a more difficult matter. A number of theories are plausible. Like all other instruments, they were probably invented simultaneously by many isolated barbaric races. The bow and arrow were undoubtedly suggestive, and it is to be presumed that primitive types of the lyre family, whose strings were originally plucked, were fitted to uncouth sounding boards and played upon with a bow. The Hindus possessed such instruments, and it is possible that their admission into Europe was concurrent with that of the lute and harp. In defense of this supposition, one might point to the dance of the women attending the jongleurs. Now, the dance is no uncertain revealer of racial characteristics, but not only the dance itself, but also certain features of the accompaniment, as well as the types of instruments peculiar to the jongleurs, bears the impress of Orientalism. As far as is known, neither the Greeks nor the Romans possessed instruments played with a bow. From the Middle Ages on, the study of instrumental evolution is, of course, based upon authentic history. The most direct line of descent for bowed instruments is probably from either the Celtic crwth or the Oriental rebab to the viol or viola of the Middle Ages, of which the last representative was the gamba, and the viola da gamba was the predecessor of the violoncello. The early viols were of manifold types, there being, for instance, as many as 7 viole de braccia and 6 viole da gamba. The violin, owes its existence to a gradual metamorphosic development of the early tenor viola during the latter part of the 15th and early 16th centuries. Skill in the manufacture of these instruments was of an advanced order in the Netherlands prior to the advent of the great Italian violin makers, whose efforts were eventually crowned by the immutable sovereignty of the Cremonese creations at the commencement of the 18th century. The introduction of the contrabasso was likewise of slow growth. For as late as the 17th and 18th centuries, there still existed bass instruments of the lute family, such as the double-necked theorbo and the largest bass lute, the cicerone, which were struck with a plectrum. But growing appreciation for the wonderful possibilities concealed in the infant violin proper of technique, tone, color, delicacy, and variety of shading reacted upon the secondary bowed instruments, and they in turn were rapidly perfected. Hence, by a judicious selection of the superior and a suppression of the inferior types of viols, were the violas and violoncellos evolved, and the theorbo and cicerone were permanently supplanted by the double bass, constructed on the same general principles as the violin. Although the ideal balance of tone and expressive powers as embodied in the modern string orchestra justifies the perspicuity of this selective process in every way, it would seem to be a matter for regret that a certain species of viols, the viola d'amore, should have become practically obsolete. Its 7 strings were supplemented by 7 concealed understrings, designed to vibrate sympathetically. One might say that this principle has been incorporated in the modern grand pianoforte by means of the una corda pedal. But since Meyerbeer resuscitated the viola d'amore in Les Huguenots in 1836, the only living composer who has assigned to it a conspicuous role is, to the present writer's knowledge, Mr. C. M. Loeffler, in his symphonic poem La Mort de Tintagiles, after Maeterlinck. Indeed, the original score contained parts for 2 solo viole d'amore, though one part has since been rewritten for a violin. Section 2. The evolution of the harp is obvious, whereas that of the pianoforte is more complex. The prototype of the modern pianoforte in its embryonic state traces its ancestry to all the various types of stringed instruments taken collectively. Specifically, the primitive acoustic monochord of Pythagoras might be looked upon as a plausible starting point. Add to this a keyboard and its attendant devices as applied to church organs in the earlier centuries of the Christian era, and the prototype is complete. Be that as it may, there were developed during the 14th and 15th centuries a family of widely known instruments embodying advanced qualities of mechanism, styled hackbrett, synonym for cembalo, tympanin, although it is best known as the dulcimer. According to Dr. Riemann, it originated apparently in Germany, since for a time it was called in Italy by the name of salterio tedesco. The instrument consisted of a flat trapezium-shaped sounding board on which steel strings were set, and was played upon by 2 hammers held one in each hand of the performer. In improved form, it is still extant in the hands of the gypsies. But already at the beginning of the 16th century, was the clavichord established as its successor. The clavichord, according to Hipkins, was derived from the polychord with 4 strings, which in turn was developed from the monochord to facilitate the melodic division of the Gregorian tones. Directly appeared still another instrument styled clavicembalo or harpsichord, of which the psaltery, a triangular harp, was undoubtedly the ancestor. The spinet and virginal differed from the harpsichord only as to shape, and in England, virginal was the general term for spinet and harpsichord. The cardinal point of dissimilarity between the mechanical construction of the clavichord and the harpsichord was that the strings of the former were caused to sound by means of metal tangents which struck against the strings and then pressed them up, whereas the strings of the latter were plucked by hard quills set in wooden jacks. But of far greater importance was the difference of tone quality. The tone of the clavichord was delicate, subdued, incapable of energetic utterance, but so expressive that it was a favorite with great musicians. That of the harpsichord was crisp, short, uniform. A radical readjustment of mechanism was found necessary in order to combine in one instrument euphony and a variation of dynamic force. Therefore, in the beginning of the 18th century, hammer action was invented, and the pianoforte, derived from the dulcimer, came into existence. Despite this fact, both the clavichord and the harpsichord continue to hold their own beyond the boundaries of that century, and so we see that the perfected modern pianoforte, being but the outcome of a variety of instruments already in existence 300 years ago, was unable to supersede them until the 19th century. And with that riveting history of the piano concluded, I think we'll end this evening's reading from the evolution of modern orchestration. I don't know about you, but I can certainly tell that this was someone's dissertation. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like to read this work for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.